Red Level and Dell Technologies.
Helping smart businesses in Metro Detroit stay ahead of the competition with hybrid cloud solutions engineered to save time, lower risk, and support future growth.
Rethink business, rethink IT.
Janette Sadik-Khan.
Hi, good morning. So it is great to be here with all of you in Detroit to talk about some of the changes that we made in New York City. And I think it's pretty timely. You take a look even at the cover of the Wall Street Journal today, and you see all of the growth that you're dealing with. And that's a lot of the challenges that we faced in New York City. And there we go. New York, like Detroit, has an incredibly extensive infrastructure. In New York, we have 6,000 miles of streets. We have 789 bridges, one of the largest ferry systems in the world. And keeping our existing infrastructure in a state of good repair while adapting to the needs of the 21st century certainly is at the top of the list of one of the big challenges that cities face. And when you think about it, we've seen demographic change in our city, we've seen technical change, cultural change, yet our basic infrastructure hasn't changed in 50 years. It's basically been frozen in time. And if you were in business and you didn't change your major capital investment in 50 years, do you think you'd still be in business? Probably not. And for years, leaders looked at streets like this and said, yep, everything's working just fine. People have become completely used to chronic congestion, and they've accepted this as the new status quo. But it wasn't always this way. This is Griswold and Front 100 years ago. And this is the same intersection 100 years later. You can see the changes. Basically, all of the options for getting around have been whittled away. But this didn't just happen. This actually happened by design. These are plans for New York City from 1923. I love this. Here's the first step. Pedestrians are removed. Second step, cars invade. It's like Venice, but with traffic sewers. And that was the policy of the United States in a nutshell. And that's how we got streets and highways like this one in Atlanta that splits the city in two and seems to grow every year. That's how we got the Katy Freeway in Houston, which cost $2.8 billion to expand. It's now one of the widest roads in the world. And the result? Morning commutes increased by 25 minutes. And in Los Angeles, when they decided to widen the 405 to add 10 miles of new carpool lanes to ease congestion, what we saw was after 5 years of construction and over $1 billion, travel times actually increased. And study after study has proved that you can't build your way out of congestion. It is like dealing with obesity by loosening your belt. And if this strategy actually worked, these cities would be moving at highway speeds instead of being stuck behind a sea of brake lights. So what we need is a fundamental rethinking of our streets. We get the cities that we build for. So if we build our cities around vehicles, we get cities that are choked with vehicles. If we build cities around people, and we make it easy to walk and to bike and to take the bus, we get a city where this is all possible. But to get there, we need a plan. Mayor Bloomberg recognized this when he launched his Plan YC initiative, long-range sustainability initiative. The goal was to reduce greenhouse gases by 30% and to accommodate the 1 million more people that were expected to move to New York City by 2030 and still improve the quality of life in business districts and neighborhoods. There were 127 different initiatives because Bloomberg knew that we needed to make course corrections today to steer the city in a new direction, much like you're seeing here in Detroit. And this had profound implications for our streets, building in more choices for how people got around, investing in bus rapid transit, investing in a bike lane network, making it safer and easier to walk around. And you can see we had a problem. This is the perfect problem statement. Designs that we had that literally left people stranded in the middle of the road. So we got to work with street designs that worked for people by literally just following their footsteps. You can see what's needed on a street. We reclaimed excess space on streets, streets that were large, streets that were small, making it easier and safer to cross the street. And we made these kinds of safety investments all over the city. Places like the Williamsburg Bridge, high crash locations here, moved to make it safer and easier to get around. We also moved to unlock the potential that was literally hidden in plain sight on our streets. This was one of our first pedestrian plazas on Pearl Street in Brooklyn. We basically turned it from a place that people wanted to park to a place that people wanted to be. Again, overnight, using temporary materials, paint, stones, planters, tables and chairs. And it's a very important point because the proof is really in the concept itself, and changing this space is so key. And you've started to realize that in downtown Detroit with many of your projects. People in New York were very skeptical that change could even happen on the streets of New York. We were still on, building the 2nd Avenue subway, which we finally completed after 60 years. People had given up that we could see change on our streets. So moving quickly to show what was possible was key. And moving fast also allowed businesses and neighborhoods to begin to reap the benefit of additional foot traffic. So that was great for business, and it was great new space for communities. And it's no surprise that these kinds of spaces are now in demand all across the city, from commercial corridors to the heart of Midtown Manhattan. It is clear that better streets are better for business. And these strategies sparked here on 34th Street, a kind of miracle on 34th Street, when we closed part of Broadway in front of Macy's, and there was a huge boost in foot traffic and in retail sales. Because a fundamental maxim is that cars don't shop, people do. Probably the most famous example of our transformations in New York City was the transformation of Times Square. How many of you have been to New York City and seen the transformation of Times Square? Okay, so most of you have been there to check it out. So you know what it was like, right? Times Square was the heart of Midtown, crossroads of the world. People had tried for years to try to fix it. Manhattan is on a grid. Broadway cuts through it on a diagonal. It does great things. It creates these spaces, Times Square, Union Square, Madison Square, but it also creates these congestion hotspots. And people had tried to fix it, I think, since 1812, when the grid was put into place. There was probably ox cart congestion, like in the 1850s. And people have been trying ever since to fix it, and nothing worked, right? Slip lane, signalization, nothing worked. And so we came to Mike Bloomberg with a proposal to close Broadway to cars between 42nd and 47th Street, because the fundamental problem was a problem of math. 90% of the space was dedicated to cars, and yet people on foot were 90% of the traffic. It was a fundamental mismatch in terms of the space. Now you can imagine people were a little bit crazy at the thought of this idea, particularly in the administration when we proposed doing this in the middle of an election year. And I remember going to City Hall to present this, and the mayor went around the big kind of Knights of the Round Table that we had up in City Hall, asked everybody what their thoughts are about closing Times Square to cars at this particular point in time. And let's just say that the idea didn't go over well. But Mike Bloomberg said, I don't ask my commissioners to do the right thing according to the political calendar. I ask my commissioners to do the right thing, period. And he shook my hand and he said, let's do it. And it was a major moment. And the idea that we were going to do it as a pilot to see how it worked. We would test it out. If it worked, we would keep it. If it didn't work, we would put it back to the way that it was before. And that made most of the stakeholders and local businesses very happy, because it reduced the anxiety, the fact that this was not going to be permanent. But the problem had been a big problem. And when you think about it, you guys come from Detroit, you go to Times Square, you're like so looking up at the billboards and the lights, and you walk like 4 abreast. And the rest of us, trying to get around in a New York minute would go crazy. And so we would jump into the street to get around you and get hit by cars. It was terrible. And so once we made these changes and rebalanced the street, we found that traffic moved much better, pedestrian injuries went down. It became one of the top 10 retail locations on the planet. And you can see the kind of transformation in progress here, from endless asphalt to these pedestrian plazas. And it started just with some, traffic cones and some beach chairs. We put those beach chairs out, and it was interesting because, the press, nobody really actually talked about the fact that we had closed Times Square to cars. The press really focused on the fact that we had these beach chairs out there. And did you like the beach chairs? Did you like the color of the beach chairs? So I'm telling all of you that are involved in big infrastructure projects, if it gets tricky, just throw out some beach chairs. That is going to take care of it. And now we've moved into the final construction, and now this space is worthy of its name, the crossroads of the world. And these kinds of projects can help people see their streets in a whole new way. We worked very closely with the Times Square Alliance, which is the equivalent of the Downtown Detroit Partnership, to program the space, doing things like yoga classes, using the space at different times of day, doing art exhibits, even very public displays of affection. And the success in Times Square is a big part of the reason you're seeing these kinds of plazas pop up all over the country, in places like Seattle, in places like Philadelphia, even in LA. And there's a seismic shift going on when LA is making these kinds of changes. Streets are a quarter of the real estate in New York, which makes New York City DOT actually the largest real estate developer there. And we found that our streets were also great canvas for art. And we created the first ever public art program, turning our streets into kind of art showcases and working with local artists to make these kinds of changes, bringing new color to old infrastructure like the Manhattan Bridge. Even something as lowly as our New Jersey barriers got a new facelift. And we invited communities to participate in all of these programs. Once we developed these showcases, whether they were plaza programs, bike programs, bus programs, we turned them into applications so that communities could apply for these programs. And that was a fundamental change in the relationship that we had with communities. It was no longer the city coming with their plaza program or bike lane program. It was the community asking for it. They requested it, and the city supported them. And a big part of the transformation was about giving people more choices for getting around, so they could hop on a bike and leave the car keys at home. We added 400 miles of new bike lanes, created the first ever parking protected bike lane in the country. Of course, none of this was easy. It wasn't easy to change things, as you all know here. When you push the status quo pushes back hard. This was probably ground zero of the backlash. It's a little street. Anybody know what this street is? This is called Prospect Park West. It's probably the most famous bike lane in the world. This was this big fight. This had been a street, there was tons of speeding, people cycling on the sidewalk. And the community asked us to fix it. We put in a two-way bike lane. It was much safer. Speeding went down 75%. Cycling tripled. Nobody on the sidewalk. Terrific, right? Turned into this huge demonstration. We were sued. The papers got really spun up. One paper called it the most contested slab of concrete outside the Gaza Strip. For that. So you can see the incredible return on investment when you actually build an infrastructure that works for people. And when we put these bike lanes in, like this protected lane on 9th Avenue, it wasn't just good for cyclists. It was good for everybody on the street. Not only did cycling triple, but these streets had 50% reduction in injuries for all users on the corridor, and they were much better for business. So you can see what we did. This is the map of bike lanes from 2007. This is 2013. It looks really easy, just lines on a map, no problem. But it worked. And our cycling story helped inspire others. And today, these kinds of designs can be found in over 50 cities. Indianapolis, And not just in Detroit, like here on East Jeff in Michigan, but also another shot of Indianapolis and Atlanta and Austin and LA, and new possibilities for streets like here on Grand River. I mean, it's exciting to see the potential that you've got here. You have such wide streets, and that is an incredible opportunity here. So after building all these bike lanes, we leveraged this investment with a new bike share system with great results. Since it launched 3 years ago, people have taken 35 million trips, and they've ridden 69 million miles, the equivalent of riding to Mars and back. And I work for a data-driven mayor, so I know all these kinds of statistics. They've also burned off the equivalent of 4.9 million Big Macs. So lots of statistics on our projects. Interestingly, City Bike had a huge impact on real estate. And so now you will find in the real estate listings proximity to City Bike station as part of the ads. And this helped spark a huge change, a culture change in New York City. And today, the typical rider is more like the guy on the right rather than the kind of Mad Max messenger on the left. And it's a big step. People using bikes for commuting and running errands. People said this would never happen. New York City is not Amsterdam. What are you doing? But it did. And now it is part of how New Yorkers get around, even how they get married. And you're seeing these systems spread all across the US, from Minnesota to Chattanooga and Chicago, and soon right here in Detroit this spring. Yay! 420 bikes coming to the streets of Detroit, which is fantastic. It's going to be a great spring. Huh? Yes. But building in more choices also doesn't have to take decades and billions of dollars. It can start with something that is not seen as very sexy. I think they're very sexy, buses. You can do a lot with buses. New York City actually has the largest bus fleet in North America, and we have the slowest bus speeds. As my traffic commissioner used to say, the only way to get across town is to be born there. So that's not a great strategy for a city. So we got to work very, very quickly building in these dedicated bus lanes, off-board fare collection, transit signal priority, giving the buses the green light when they hit intersections, rolled out 7 lines in 6 years in all 5 boroughs. It had dramatic impact, incredible improvement in travel time and in ridership. And we did it all over town, on Staten Island to Midtown Manhattan on 34th Street, paying before you get on the bus, real-time bus information, and this was all great news for the 225,000 people a day who actually use these routes. Really using our streets to kind of create a surface subway. And you're now seeing this all over the country, places like the Heartline system in Cleveland to LA. And cities like Houston are doing interesting things, just redrawing their existing bus map to create a kind of high-frequency network, which is something that DDOT is looking to do here with this system. And it's exciting to think of the possibilities that you have here, even like Michigan Avenue. You know, the RTA referendum failed, but there is so much more you can do to build in new mobility to the DNA of Detroit. And you know, you're probably thinking that all of these changes, these crazy changes, were a problem. But at the end of the day, it was so interesting because people were so far ahead of the press and the politicians when it came to their streets. You know, what we saw at the end of the Bloomberg administration was a 73% support for bike share. We saw a 72% support for bike lanes and a 64% support for bike lanes. If this had been an election, it would have been a landslide. And data was a critical part of the program. As my mayor used to say, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And so we brought lots and lots of data. And we went beyond counting cars and what happened curb to curb to looking at what happened at the cash register. And we found that on streets with protected bike lanes, we saw retail sales soar almost 50%. And we saw similar results with our plaza programs and with our bus programs. We saw a dramatic decrease in vacancy rates. And on select bus service routes like on Fordham Road, a 71% increase in retail sales along those corridors. This kind of data was really important because it turned some of our biggest opponents into some of our biggest supporters. And we've gone from streets that were governed by anecdote to streets that were governed by analysis, because it's completely reliable in New York City. What would normally happen is a reporter would go up to a cabbie and say, hey, what do you think of this new plaza or bike lane or bus lane? And the answer, I couldn't tell you what the answer was right now because it's filled with so many expletives. But instead of just saying, yes, that's how it is, having the data goes such a long way to making the case. And importantly, for all of the headlines that these kinds of projects generated, this work, the bikes, the buses, the plazas, was less than 1% of our state of good repair budget. These are projects that any city can afford to do. In fact, you can't afford not to. And all of this work has been translated into a new operating code for cities. The National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is a group that I chair, has come together to create these new design guidelines because so many of the rules of the road for our streets are outdated. They're 50 years old and they don't work. And what would happen reliably is if somebody wanted to make a change, an engineer would point to the AASHTO Green Book or the MUTCD and say, sorry, it's not in the book, we can't do it. And so we created these new guides to give cities a permission slip to innovate, to update the designs that we need for 21st century streets. And these guides have now been adopted by the US Department of Transportation, and it turns this kind of local experience and best practices into design guidance, and flips the hierarchy that has governed our streets for so long from one that emphasizes cars on top to one that puts people first. And a big part of this change is making more effective use of the infrastructure that we already have. And years ago, Union Station was down to 2 trains a day. And today, it is the heart of this new retail development with 5 new light rail lanes, commuter rail lines, bus service. It's led to $1 billion in new private investment. And you can imagine what Detroit could do with a new multimodal hub joining the Q line and Amtrak, commuter rail and bus service. Places all over the country and all over the world are looking at these kinds of new playbooks for change. Places like Queens Quay on the Toronto waterfront are building complete streets and showing that people biking and walking and taking transit can play well together. Chicago recently developed the Loop Link using this new design guidance, putting in protected bus lanes and protected intersections. And these new design guides show the power of the possible with new kinds of blueprints that can serve many more people. There are hundreds of transformations that are taking place around the world. This is Bogota, which created a new public space over a weekend, to even the work that you're seeing here in Campus Martius, and how to get from rendering to a new reality. And designs for all of these kinds of projects, like the adaptive reuse of former highways you've seen in places like Boston with the Big Dig, the possibilities for Park East Freeway in Milwaukee, even smaller cities like Rochester are looking at their infrastructure in a new way and realizing the potential that is hidden in plain sight. And in New York, we actually tore down the West Side Highway, which was this elevated highway, and we created Hudson River Park. And over the last 15 years, we've seen $8 billion of investment within a quarter mile of the park. It's become the kind of gold coast of the Hudson River. And you can imagine striking the same gold here with I-375, using that right-of-way and opening up downtown to the east side of the city. And I can think of no other city that is as well positioned as Detroit is. You have streets that are made for a city 4 times the size of the one that you have. And with the population, poised to grow for the first time in decades, now is the time to act and to build a foundation for a new Detroit. And Detroit is at a turning point. Next spring, you're going to see a tremendous launch of new projects: Bike Share, the Q Line, Gratiot Randolph, Jefferson Woodward, all of these projects coming online this spring. It is a very exciting moment. And you've seen what's possible with things like the DeKindercut project, which is fantastic, a model for so many other places. You can see River Plaza. There is an energy here. It is so electric. I think you just need to seize this energy and to rethink the streets that you have now, while you still have plenty of room to work with. And our streets can accommodate everyone. These are not either-or options, and it is not a question of engineering. It is a question of imagination. It takes vision, it takes political courage, it takes all of you in this room. But remember, you are not just changing the streets. For millions of people in New York, in Detroit, and around the world, you are changing the world. Thank you.